Paco. I have the easy part tonight. I met Paco only a few years ago when he came up to me at a party and said, "Are you related to Liz and Claude Warren?" Those are my parents. They're both historians, archaeologists, and he was something of a student of theirs, I was pleased to find, and that's actually how we met. I bring that up because it's an interesting part of the story. Despite the fact that I come from a family of historians and we've been in Las Vegas since 1969, none of us had ever heard of Lee S.J. Hunt. Lee S.J. Hunt is the man for whom the Huntridge and Huntridge neighborhood are named. Lee S.J. Hunt was born in 1855, and he was the first guy to envision the Las Vegas Strip. He was also the first person to strike a shovel anywhere to make sure it was developed. But that was much later on. Earlier, he was the third president by age 29 of Iowa State University. In Iowa, he married and had children. It didn't stay long. He decided to go off to distant lands where he sought adventure and fortune. The first place he went was a place called the Territory of Washington, before Washington was a state. In Washington, he struck up various syndications with investors. He almost immediately took over the Post-Intelligencer newspaper, turned it into a daily, started a bank, and became the wealthiest citizen in Seattle. He lost everything in the Panic of 1893. So that was a quick roller coaster up and right back down again. He gained great notoriety in the process, though, because despite having his bank, losing his fortune in his bank, losing his fortune in mining shares, he did manage to maintain the deposits in the bank by making a run to New York and coming back with a suitcase filled with $1 million in cash from J.P. Morgan. After Seattle, he looked around for other opportunities, and had already been considering invitations from Alberta, Canada. He was an ag man. Agriculture was his education, and he had been invited to explore the possibility of turning the Peace River Valley into a huge wheat field, the breadbasket of Canada. He brought in investors, specifically the Barons Moncrieff of Scotland, and did exactly that over the next few years. He followed that up by moving to North Korea before the turn of the century. He was the first Westerner ever to hold a deal with the North Korean government, what's now North Korea, then was the Empire of Korea. He partnered with the emperor himself, and although he sold most of the shares of that mining operation 5 years later, that operation pulled out $50 million in gold over the next 30 years. While in Korea, Lee Hunt's health was not great. He didn't handle wet weather well. He had a kidney problem that kept him from staying in the wet weather for very long. So he would travel around a lot through Asia, and his doctors in Shanghai told him that he needed a dry climate, and they highly recommended the Sudan. A friend of his in France, yeah, who wouldn't recommend the Sudan, right? A friend of his in France told him that there was an amazing opportunity in the Sudan, that he had been there, and the friend's father had been there, a guy named Henry de Villemorin. And his friend, Philippe de Villemorin, said there's a great opportunity there if somebody figures out how to grow cotton on the banks of that Nile River. So Lee S.J. Hunt packed up his family again. They had been with him in Korea, where his wife, Jessie Noble Hunt, had dressed like a boy in order to get into North Korea. And they packed up again, and they went off to the Sudan. And in the Sudan, he created Egyptian long staple cotton and made yet another fortune. He also decided that he found that the labor skills did not exist in the Sudan at the time, and that the tribal attributes of the peoples made it impossible to train them within a generation to industrialize the agricultural cotton that he envisioned on hundreds of thousands of acres. So he partnered with an American named Booker T. Washington. And he and Booker T. Washington decided that if they could get American blacks from the South who were familiar with farming cotton to move to the Sudan, they could make a fortune. Not just Hunt, but also the workers who went to the Sudan. Booker T. Washington partnered with Hunt and sent from Tuskegee skilled labor to the Sudan, and hundreds of thousands of acres of cotton were successfully farmed by Hunt. During this time, he also got the attention of Teddy Roosevelt, who was, of course, always longing for the far-off, distant place, and kept hearing about this guy, Leigh Hunt, off in the Sudan, off in Korea. He became an advisor on the Russian-Japanese War, and he was this amazing guy who was all over the planet. And he also began to hear about his son, a guy named Henry Leigh Hunt, who came of age in just as they entered the Sudan, and his exploits up the Nile and his familiarity with the locals and the natives, and his ability to navigate the local environs, and as well as the tributaries to the Nile that nobody had mapped, made him quite well known in the White House, which led to Teddy Roosevelt utilizing the Hunt expertise and having them not only partially host his famous trip up the Nile after his presidency, but also pay for it. Along with Andrew Carnegie, they funded that mission. While Lee S.J. Hunt lived in the Sudan, in 1916, his son Henry Leigh Hunt joined the American Expeditionary Forces when the U.S. entered World War I. By 1923, Lee S.J. Hunt was witnessing the construction of the Sennar Dam in the Upper Nile. It was a life-changing event for him to see this happen. The Sennar Dam to this day is a tremendous dam, and it creates an amazing amount of power and water. And he saw that kind of opportunity is something that he needed to pay attention to all over the planet. And that's when he heard about the Boulder Canyon project. Somebody told him they were going to build another big dam in another desert, but this time in the U.S. So he started looking into the Boulder Canyon project and what would become Hoover Dam. And he said, back in the 20s, if they build Hoover Dam, then that little town of Las Vegas will become the resort corridor of the world. And everybody said, you're crazy, it's going to be Palm Springs. And he said, no, it's not. They don't have the Las Vegas Valley. They don't have the crossed highways, the railroad. It's got all the right attributes. The lake that will form will be amazing. He was completely sold on it, and he sold many others on it. So he came into Las Vegas, and he bought up 4,000 acres next to the tiny town of Las Vegas, population 3,500, no decent hotel, no casino, no legalized gaming, pretty dusty railroad pioneer town. When he came into town, you know, all we hear about when we hear about people investing in Las Vegas, what do we hear about? Oh, Bugsy Siegel, right? This kind of thing. This was way before any of these guys ever dreamt of that. Bugsy Siegel was 17 years old when Lee S.J. Hunt brought in an admiral from the Spanish-American War, the Governor General of Bermuda, the premier architect of Hong Kong, a pioneer of international banking and the vice president of National City Bank, New York, Paris, and St. Petersburg, managers of his mining operations in Korea, Scottish barons, the director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and many, many others. They all came in with Leigh Hunt. They bought shares in his companies, and they bought up tremendous amounts of real estate in Las Vegas. Leigh Hunt died in 1933. It took me a while to find his grave. It was kind of confusing that I could not find where he was interred. It was listed on his obits that he was buried at Forest Lawn, but they did not have him. And it was only later that I found out through another article where he was interred. Are there any Huntsakers in the room? I wish there were. Many of us know the Huntsaker family locally, and it was because of Leigh Hunt's longtime secretary, his corporate secretary and private secretary, who had joined him in 1929, Walter Huntsaker of Las Vegas. Walter reported what happened in 1937 when he finally helped fulfill Leigh Hunt's last wish, which was that his ashes be sprinkled on Lake Mead, the only person known to be interred in Lake Mead. Remember, Leigh Hunt had a son, Henry Leigh Hunt. Henry Leigh Hunt moved back to Las Vegas after World War I and after he'd spent some time abroad. In 1925, he arrived with his wife, a very famous French author named Louise de Vilmorin. If you Google Louise, you'll find her all over the place. Most recently, in a book entitled Seductress, which chronicles the 36 greatest seductresses of all time, of which Louise is one. Henry takes over the estate of his father around 1929, as his father is up in age. And he lives in Las Vegas for a time with his wife, and then where they have 3 daughters. And he returns to Paris in 1933. In Paris, he becomes the vice president and the head of the trust department for National City Bank, New York's Paris branch, with his old friends. In the run-up to World War II, in the 1930s, and especially into the late 1930s and all the way up to 1940, he's filing reports, very detailed reports, where he types very detailed accounts that are reported to him by people from all over Europe. His friends are 4-star generals, ambassadors, former presidents, current presidents. They are pilots from World War I who have become airport inspectors. They are people in the know all over the industrialized world. And they report back to Henry in Paris, on. And he dutifully writes these notes, somehow gets them to Walter Hunsaker in Las Vegas, who types them all up, keeping a copy in the file, and sends them on to the banks in New York where they're intended, who act on the intelligence. This went on for years. It started in about 1935, and the letters drop off right as Paris becomes occupied by the Nazis. It took me a while to find out what happened to Henry during the occupation of Paris, but when I found his sole surviving daughter, I asked her I can't find when Henry left Paris, and you were in Paris with him, right? When did that happen? And she said, October 26th, 1941. 14 months in occupied Paris. Who had moved to Paris from Russia. One of them was one of the Society of Cincinnati, a direct descendant of Lafayette, General Charles de Chambrun. The other was Nicolas de Basile. Nicolas de Basile was the Tsar Nicholas II's foreign minister. He was married to the daughter of one of the men who worked for the Hunts. Those two had moved to Paris and were clients of the bank in Paris. Henry was their trust officer. If you don't speak the language, what that means is he was hiding flight capital in the run-up to World War II. By 1939, de Basile, who was a very well-known diplomat for the Tsars, knew the Nazis were coming, and he fled. He became a very prominent aide to diplomacy in the United States. General de Chambrun was not so fortunate to be able to flee so early, and was stuck in Paris in October of 1941 when Henry Lee Hunt got him out. I know he got him out because the people who were with him were his 3 daughters. He helped the general through Vichy France, across the border into Spain, into Portugal, and out on the HMS Exeter on its last trip across the Atlantic. Henry's daughters even smuggled the Chambrun jewels in their doll clothes boxes to get across the borders. Henry then returned to the U.S., where he set up General de Chambrun in Washington, and he became a very famous advisor to the French embassy before returning to France and becoming a member of the Académie Française. Henry then returned to Las Vegas, which had a population of about 8,900 in 1942. And one of the things he struck out to do was to build a theater with 900 seats in a town of 8,900 people on a street with no sidewalks. It sounds crazy, right? We know it, of course, as the Huntridge. But beyond that also, the land that the Hunts owned, the 4,000 acres that they controlled through the corporations that had come together with all of those distinguished investors. On that land, they either formed, sold, or leased the land to the El Rancho, the Riviera, the Thunderbird, the Landmark, Circus, the Convention Center Drive, everything on Convention Center Drive, the Desert Inn, the Las Vegas Country Club, the Huntridge Neighborhood, and the Mesquite Club. I never would have known any of this, but I was appointed consul of Monaco in October of 2010. I'm the second to fill the seat. The first to fill the seat was Henry Lee Hunt. He was appointed in 1955 by recommendation of his then former wife, Louise de Vilmorin, who won a Distinguished Literary Award in Monaco. In my own history, I moved to Las Vegas with my parents in 1969. I was 5 years old. We lived at 1404 Maryland Parkway in Huntridge. The first movie I went to was at the Huntridge. I learned to roller skate on Maryland Parkway. I remember going to see Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I think that was 44 years ago today. at the Huntridge. So for me, I've always known the Huntridge, but for me, the effort to save the Huntridge goes far deeper than just saving another historic building, although that is important. For me, it's also preserving the legacy of the first visionary of the Las Vegas Strip. Lee S.J. Hunt died the year gaming became legal, 1933. He supported the legalization of gaming, but he also very adamantly said, if we make it so people have to go through a casino to get to the hotel, we'll regret it. Funny how things come full circle. That'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Wow, that's remarkable. It's an amazing story. It's going to make a great book, Jonathan. Thank you so very much.